In the summer of 2003, every commercial tomato field in Yancey County, North Carolina, turned black and died in 11 days. Every field except one. On that one farm, on the south slope of a ridge outside Burnsville, for acres of tomatoes stood untouched. Green leaves, ripening fruit, healthy vines climbing their stakes the way tomatoes are supposed to. The man who owned that farm was 43 years old, and for 20 years his neighbors had been laughing at the seeds he planted. They weren't laughing anymore. Let me tell you about Tucker Ramsey, because he's the man at the center of this story. Tucker was born in 1960 in a farmhouse his great-grandfather had built in 1894. He'd grown up on the same Yancey County hillside where his family had been farming since before the Civil War. By the time Tucker took over the operation in 1983, when his father died of cancer at 54, the Ramsey farm was 80 acres of tomatoes, beans, and squash. It wasn't a big farm. It wasn't a fancy farm. It was a kind of small mountain operation that had been the backbone of western North Carolina for generations. But Tucker had something the other farmers in Yancey County didn't have. He had a coffee can full of seeds his grandmother had given him. Her name was Bessie Ramsey. She was 81 years old when she handed Tucker that coffee can in the spring of 1983, 3 weeks after his father's funeral. Tucker had walked out to her little house behind the main farmhouse, the house she'd lived in since her husband died in 1971, and she'd been waiting for him on the porch with the can in her lap. The can was old. The label had been scratched off decades ago. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and tied with kitchen string, were 7 small cloth bags of tomato seeds. "These are yours now," Bessie said. "Your daddy never wanted them. Said they were too much trouble, but you're going to want them. Tucker, you're going to want them more than anything else this farm has." Tucker was 23 years old. He'd just buried his father. He had a mortgage to pay and a crop to put in the ground, and a mother who was too grief-struck to leave the house. The last thing he needed was a coffee can full of his grandmother's seeds. "What kind of tomatoes are these, Granny?" "They came from my grandmother. Her name was Sarah Honeycut. She brought them up from Tennessee in 1898 when she married my grandfather. They came to her from her grandmother, who got them from a Cherokee woman in 1851. Before that, I don't know, but they've been in our family for at least 130 years. Tucker, maybe longer." Tucker looked into the coffee can at the 7 small bags. "What do they taste like?" Bessie smiled, and her face folded into the lines that 81 years of mountain weather had carved into it. "Like nothing you've ever eaten. Like the way tomatoes used to taste before they started growing them in greenhouses and shipping them in trucks. Plant them, Tucker. Plant a row of them every year. Save the seed every fall. Don't you ever let them die out." Tucker took the coffee can home. He set it on a shelf in his barn. He didn't plant the seeds that first year because he didn't know what he was doing yet, and he was afraid he'd ruin them. He planted them the second year, and the third, and every year after that for the next 20 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Let me tell you about the honeycut tomato, because the seed is the soul of this story. The variety Bessie Ramsey gave Tucker had no official name. The seed catalogs of the world had never heard of it. The agricultural research stations of North Carolina State University had never recorded it. It existed nowhere in the formal seed economy of the modern food system. It existed only on one farm in Yancey County, in the memory of one family, in 7 small cloth bags inside an old coffee can. The honeycut tomato, as Tucker came to call it, was an open pollinated variety. That means it reproduced naturally, the way tomatoes had reproduced for 10,000 years before commercial seed companies started producing hybrids in laboratories. Every fall, Tucker would walk his honeycut rows and select fruit from the strongest, healthiest plants. He'd cut those tomatoes open, scoop out the seed and pulp, ferment them in jars on his kitchen counter for 3 days, then rinse the seed clean and dry it on paper towels in his back room. He'd label each batch by year. He'd store them in cloth bags in a cabinet in his pantry, the way his grandmother had stored them, the way her grandmother had stored them before that. The fruit itself was nothing like a supermarket tomato. The skin was thin and easily bruised. The shape was irregular, sometimes lobed, sometimes nearly round, sometimes elongated like a pear. The color was a deep pink red, darker around the shoulders. The flesh was dense and complex. The flavor was something Tucker had no words for, the kind of flavor that older people in Yancey County remembered from their childhood gardens and that younger people had never tasted at all. But the honeycut had a problem. It didn't ship well. It bruised in transit. It didn't ripen uniformly. The yields per acre were lower than the commercial varieties. The fruit set was unreliable in extreme heat. By every measure that mattered to a modern commercial tomato operation, the honeycut was inferior. By every measure except one. The honeycut tomato had been growing in southern Appalachian soil for at least 150 years, possibly much longer. It had survived every disease, every drought, every flood, every pest invasion that had ever come through these mountains. The genetics in those 7 cloth bags carried 150 years of survival memory. Every fall, when Tucker selected seed from the healthiest plants, he was continuing a process that had been going on since before the Civil War. Adaptation, selection, resilience. The commercial hybrids couldn't compete with that because the commercial hybrids were 10 or 20 years old at most. They had been bred in research stations in California or Florida or the Netherlands. They had been optimized for traits that matter to grocery stores: uniform size, smooth skin, long shelf life, predictable harvest dates. They had not been optimized for survival in Yancey County, North Carolina, because nobody who bred them had ever set foot in Yancey County. Tucker didn't know any of this in 1983. He just planted his grandmother's seeds because his grandmother had asked him to. He'd learned the rest the hard way over the next 20 years. Now let me tell you about the laughter, because it started early and it lasted a long time. The first man to laugh at Tucker's tomatoes was Roy Frazier, who farmed 200 acres of commercial tomatoes on flatter ground over Micaville. Roy was 41 years old in 1983, twice Tucker's age, and he had what was considered the most modern tomato operation in Yancey County. He grew better boy hybrids on stakes. He sprayed regularly. He sold to the regional packers who shipped to grocery store chains across the Southeast. Roy drove past Tucker's place one Saturday in June of 1983 and saw Tucker out in his field staking up tomato plants that didn't look like any tomato plants Roy had ever seen. The leaves were a slightly different shape. The plants were taller and ringier. Some of them had odd colorations on the stems. Roy stopped his truck and walked over the fence. "Tucker, what in God's name are you growing there?" "My grandmother's tomatoes." "Your grandmother's tomatoes?" "Yes, sir." "Tucker, those don't look right. Those plants look sick or something." "They're not sick. That's just how they grow." Roy stood at the fence and shook his head. "Son, I know you just lost your daddy, and I know you're trying to figure things out, but growing your grandmother's tomatoes isn't going to pay the bills. You need real tomatoes, the kind that the packers will buy. You come over my place sometime, and I'll show you what a proper tomato operation looks like." Tucker said he'd think about it. He didn't go. By the end of that summer, Roy Frazier was telling the story all over the county. Tucker Ramsey's growing his grandmother's tomatoes up there on the ridge. Boy's lost his mind. Probably going to lose the farm by Christmas. The story stuck. By 1984, Tucker had a reputation in Yancey County. He was the boy who grew the funny tomatoes. He was the boy who wouldn't take advice. He was the boy whose grandmother had given him a coffee can full of seeds and who had decided, against all the wisdom of modern agriculture, that those seeds were worth planting. The mockery wasn't always cruel. Some of it was just the kind of small-town joking that men do when they don't know what else to say. But it was constant. At the feed store, at the gas station, at the post office, at the Methodist church on Sunday mornings. "How's the family heirlooms doing this year, Tucker? You sure those tomatoes aren't actually weeds, Tucker? My wife wants to know if she can come pick a bouquet. Tucker, decoration for the kitchen table." Tucker didn't respond to the jokes. He didn't offend himself. He didn't argue. He just planted his grandmother's seeds every spring, saved the best ones every fall, and kept on farming. Let me tell you about the local market, because that's where Tucker's story started to turn before the blight ever arrived. In 1986, Tucker started selling honeycut tomatoes at the Saturday Farmers Market in Asheville, an hour's drive south of his farm. He didn't expect much. He just had more tomatoes than his family could eat, and he figured he'd see if anyone in Asheville wanted them. The first Saturday, he sold 3 pounds. The second Saturday, an older woman named Margaret came back to his stand with her sister. "This tomato," Margaret said, "this is what tomatoes used to taste like. Where did you get this seed?" "My grandmother." "What's the variety?" "It doesn't have a name. We just call it the honeycut." Margaret bought 10 pounds. Her sister bought 8. The third Saturday, Margaret was there before Tucker had finished setting up his stand. She'd brought 4 friends. Each one of them bought tomatoes. 2 of them came back the next week with friends of their own. By the end of the summer of 1986, Tucker was selling out his entire weekly harvest of honeycut tomatoes by 10 a.m. every Saturday. By 1988, he had a waiting list. By 1990, restaurants in Asheville were calling him during the week, asking him to set aside cases. He still couldn't compete with Roy Frazier on volume. Roy was selling tens of thousands of pounds per week to the regional packers. Tucker was selling a few hundred pounds per week at the farmers market and to a handful of restaurants. But Tucker was getting paid $4 a pound, while Roy was getting paid 40 cents. Tucker didn't tell anyone in Yancey County about the price difference. He just kept driving down to Asheville every Saturday, kept selling his grandmother's tomatoes, kept saving his seed every fall. By 1995, he had paid off the mortgage his father had left him. By 1998, he had built a new packing shed and bought a refrigerated van. By 2001, he was making more money on his 4 acres of honeycuts than Roy Frazier was making on his 200 acres of Better Boys. The men at the feed store still laughed at him. Tucker still didn't respond. Now, let me tell you about the blight, because that's the part of the story that nobody saw coming. In late June of 2003, a fungal disease called late blight appeared in tomato fields in southwestern Virginia. Late blight is the same pathogen that caused the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. It can destroy an entire field of tomatoes in less than a week. The spores travel on wind and rain. Once it gets established in an area, it moves fast. The Virginia outbreak made the agricultural news that week. By the 1st of July, late blight had been confirmed in 4 counties in Tennessee. By the 5th of July, it had reached the North Carolina mountains. Roy Frazier got the call from his county extension agent on the morning of July 7th. "Roy, you need to start spraying chlorothalonil immediately. This blight is moving fast, and your hybrid tomatoes have no resistance." Roy started spraying that afternoon. He used the maximum legal application rate. He covered every inch of his 200 acres in 36 hours. It didn't work. By July 12th, Roy was seeing the first lesions on his lower leaves. Brown spots with a slight yellow halo. Within 48 hours, the spots had spread to the upper canopy. Within 4 days, entire plants were collapsing. By July 18th, half of Roy Frazier's tomato operation was dead. He sprayed again. He sprayed a different fungicide. He hired men to walk the rows and pull infected plants by hand. Nothing slowed it down. By July 21st, Roy Frazier had lost everything. 200 acres of Better Boys. $300,000 worth of tomatoes. The largest single-season loss in the history of Yancey County agriculture. He wasn't alone. Every commercial tomato grower in the county was watching the same thing happen on their farms. The Carter operation outside Cane River. The Wilson place over by Pensacola, the Big Henderson farm that supplied for supermarket chains in Charlotte. By the end of July, Yancey County had lost an estimated 1,400 acres of commercial tomatoes. The damage was being measured in millions. Tucker Ramsey was watching it happen from his ridge. The blight had reached his property line on July 14th. He could see the brown lesions in the woods that bordered his fields, on the wild tomato relatives and the nightshade plants that grew along his fence lines. The spores were everywhere. The pressure was as high as it could get. But Tucker's tomatoes were green. The first lesions appeared on his honeycut plants on July 16th. He saw them on a Tuesday morning when he was walking his field at dawn. 3 small brown spots on the lower leaves of one plant in the 3rd row. Tucker stood there for a long time looking at those spots. He'd been waiting 20 years to see what would happen if a real disease pressure ever came against his grandmother's tomatoes. He pulled the infected plant out by the roots, carried it to the burn pile at the edge of his property, and went back to walking the rows. By July 18th, he had pulled 14 infected plants out of his 4 acres. By July 22nd, he had pulled 23 more. But the disease wasn't spreading the way it was spreading on Roy Frazier's farm. It wasn't moving from plant to plant. The blight was hitting individual plants here and there across the field, but the surrounding plants stayed healthy. The honeycut tomato wasn't immune to late blight. No tomato is immune to late blight, but the honeycut tomato was a genetically diverse population. Every plant in Tucker's field was slightly different from every other plant. Some plants had stronger natural resistance than others. The vulnerable plants got sick and died. The resistant plants kept going. This is what plant geneticists call population resistance, the survival of a diverse population through the sacrifice of its weaker members. It only works in open pollinated varieties because every individual is genetically unique. It does not work in hybrid varieties because every individual is genetically identical. When a hybrid field gets hit by a disease, every plant fails together because every plant has the same vulnerabilities. Tucker didn't know any of this in scientific terms. He just watched what was happening in his field and understood it intuitively, the same way his grandmother had understood it, the same way her grandmother had understood it before her. By the end of July, Tucker had lost about 8% of his honeycut plants to the blight. Roy Frazier had lost 100% of his better boys. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Now let me tell you about the day the county extension agent came up the ridge, because that's the day Tucker's 20 years of mockery ended. His name was Wendell Bishop. He was 34 years old, had a master's degree in plant pathology from NC State, and had been a Yancey County extension agent for 6 years. He'd watched the blight devastate his county. He'd been driving from farm to farm for 2 weeks taking samples, writing reports, comforting farmers who were watching their livelihoods turn black in the field. On August 4th, Wendell drove up Tucker's gravel driveway in his county truck. He'd heard rumors. He'd dismissed them at first. Now he was here to see for himself. Tucker met him at the gate. "Mr. Ramsey, I'm Wendell Bishop from the extension office. I heard you still got tomatoes." "I do. Mind if I take a look?" "Come on." Wendell walked the 4 acres of honeycuts with Tucker beside him. He looked at the leaves. He looked at the stems. He looked at the fruit. He pulled samples from a dozen different plants and put them in plastic bags. He examined the soil. He took photographs. After 90 minutes, he stopped at the edge of the field and stood there with his hat in his hand. "Mr. Ramsey, I don't understand what I'm looking at. Tomatoes? I've been to 17 farms in this county in the last 3 weeks. I've seen 17 total losses. Every one of them growing commercial hybrids. Every one of them sprayed with the best fungicides money can buy. And I drive up here, and you got 4 acres of healthy plants that you've never sprayed once. And you're telling me you grew them from seeds your grandmother gave you in 1983. "That's right. What variety are these?" "They don't have a real name. My family calls them the honeycut." "Where did your grandmother get them?" "From her grandmother. They came up from Tennessee in 1898. Wendell Bishop was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the field. "Mr. Ramsey, I'd like to come back next week with some colleagues from NC State. Would that be all right? Bring whoever you want. And if they ask, would you be willing to share some of your seeds with the university for research purposes?" Tucker thought about that. "I'll tell you what. You bring them up here and let me hear what they have to say. Then I'll decide." Wendell shook Tucker's hand and drove down the ridge. The state team came up the following Tuesday. There were 3 of them: Dr. Patricia Hollings, head of the tomato breeding program; Dr. Ray Echeverria, a plant pathologist specializing in fungal diseases; and a graduate student named Alyssa Park, who was carrying a clipboard and a digital camera. They walked the field with Tucker for 2 hours. They took more samples than Wendell had taken. They examined the seedlings Tucker had started in his greenhouse for next year's crop. They asked him about his selection process, his seed-saving methods, his fertility program, his irrigation, his planting dates. When they were done, Dr. Hollings asked if they could sit down somewhere to talk. Tucker brought them into his kitchen. His wife, Rebecca, made coffee. The four of them sat around the kitchen table where Tucker's father had eaten breakfast every morning for 40 years before he died. "Mr. Ramsey," Dr. Hollings said, "I want to be direct with you about what we're seeing on your farm. We have studied late blight resistance in tomatoes for decades. There are commercial breeding programs that have spent millions of dollars trying to produce a tomato variety with the kind of resistance your honeycut seems to have. None of them have succeeded. And here you are, on a small farm in Yancey County, with a heritage variety that nobody outside your family has ever heard of, and it's surviving an outbreak that has wiped out every commercial tomato in 3 counties. My grandmother gave me the seeds. I understand. What I'm trying to tell you is that what you have on this farm is genuinely unique, genetically valuable, important to the future of tomato breeding in the Southeast and possibly far beyond." Dr. Echeverria leaned forward. "Mr. Ramsey, we'd like to discuss the possibility of incorporating your honeycut genetics into the university breeding program. We could potentially develop new resistant varieties using your seeds as parent material. The benefit to commercial tomato growers across the Southeast could be substantial." Tucker looked at his coffee cup. He thought about his grandmother handing him the coffee on her porch in the spring of 1983. He thought about the 7 small cloth bags. He thought about the Cherokee woman in 1851 who had given the seeds to Sarah Honeycutt's grandmother. What would you do with the seeds? "We would maintain them in our seed bank. We would cross them with commercial varieties to identify the resistance genes. Eventually, we would develop hybrid varieties that combine your genetics with commercial traits like uniform fruit size and shipping durability. And those hybrid varieties, would farmers be able to save the seed?" Dr. Hollings paused. "No, Mr. Ramsey. Hybrid varieties don't reproduce true to type. The farmers would need to purchase new seed every year from the seed companies that license the variety from the university. So you'd take my grandmother's seeds, breed them into something farmers couldn't save, and sell it back to them through seed companies. That's how the modern seed economy works, Mr. Ramsey." Tucker was quiet for a long moment. "My great-great-grandmother was given these seeds by a Cherokee woman in 1851. The Cherokee woman didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for a contract. She just gave the seeds because they were good seeds and they deserved to be planted. My great-great-grandmother carried them up from Tennessee and gave them to her daughter. Her daughter gave them to my grandmother. My grandmother gave them to me. None of those women asked for money. None of them filed patents. None of them sold the seeds to a company that would lock them up." He looked at Dr. Hollings. "I'm not going to be the Ramsey who broke that chain." The kitchen was silent. "I'll share the seeds," Tucker said, "free, with anyone who wants them. Farmers, gardeners, researchers, the university, anybody. Anyone who plants them, who saves the seed, who keeps them alive, can have them. But nobody is going to patent my grandmother's tomatoes. Nobody is going to lock them up. They've been free for at least 150 years. They're going to stay free." Dr. Hollings looked at Dr. Echeverria. Dr. Echeverria looked at Tucker. "Mr. Ramsey," Dr. Hollings said finally, "would you be willing to participate in our research program on those terms? We won't patent the variety. We won't license it commercially. We'll simply study it, document it, and maintain it in the public seed bank, freely available to any farmer who requests it. On those terms, yes." They shook hands at the kitchen door. Tucker walked them down to their truck. Before they drove away, Alyssa Park, the graduate student, turned back. "Mr. Ramsey, can I ask you one thing?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you ever sell out? You could have made a lot of money over the years if you'd licensed these genetics to a commercial breeder." Tucker thought about that for a moment. "My grandmother gave them to me free. The only way to honor, that is, to keep them free. Money would have ended the chain. I wasn't going to be the link that broke. Let me tell you about the seed sharing, because that's what changed Yancey County, and eventually a lot more than Yancey County. By the spring of 2004, Tucker was packaging honeycut seeds in small envelopes and giving them away at the Asheville Farmers Market. By 2005, he was shipping them by mail to anyone who wrote and asked. By 2006, the local agriculture extension office was distributing them at workshops on heritage tomato varieties. By 2008, the honeycut was being grown in 17 states. The university honored its agreement. The honeycut genetics were studied, documented, and entered into the public seed bank. No patents were filed. No commercial licenses were issued. The variety remained what it had always been, a free seed, available to anyone who wanted to plant it. The 2003 blight kept moving across the country. By 2009, it had reached the Pacific Northwest. By 2012, it was a recurring problem in commercial tomato operations across the United States. The damage to the industry totaled billions of dollars over the following decade, but the honeycut kept growing in small gardens, in community plots, on family farms, in university research stations from California to Maine. The chain that Sarah Honeycutt had started in 1898, that the Cherokee woman had started in 1851, that nobody knew how far back it really went, kept extending. Roy Frazier didn't make it through the 2003 blight, financially intact. He lost his farm to the bank in 2005. He moved to Charlotte and took a job at a hardware store. The last time Tucker saw him was at the funeral of an old friend in 2009. They shook hands and said the things men say to each other when they don't know what else to say. Before Roy walked away, he stopped and turned back. "Tucker, I want you to know something. I'm sorry for all the things I said about your grandmother's tomatoes." "It's all right, Roy." "It's not. You were right. You were right the whole time, and we wouldn't listen." Tucker thought about that for a moment. "Roy, my grandmother used to tell me something. She said the old varieties carry more than just genetics. They carry the memory of all the years they've survived, all the soils they've grown in, all the hands that have planted them. She said that memory was worth more than any laboratory could produce." I didn't understand what she meant until 2003. Then I understood completely. Roy nodded. "I wish I'd had a grandmother like that." "You probably did, Roy. We all probably did. We just stopped listening to them." Let me tell you about Tucker now, because the story doesn't end with the blight. Tucker Ramsey is 66 years old. He still farms the same 80 acres on the south slope of the ridge outside Burnsville. He still grows the honeycut tomato. He still saves seed every fall, the same way his grandmother showed him in 1983. His grandmother Bessie died in 1991, 8 years after she handed him the coffee can. She lived long enough to see Tucker pay off the mortgage. She lived long enough to know her seeds were safe. She did not live long enough to see the blight or the vindication. But Tucker thinks about her every fall when he saves seed, and he thinks about her every spring when he plants. His daughter Hannah took over much of the operation in 2018. She's 34 now. She has her own daughter, Lily, who is 6, and Lily has been helping with the seed saving since she was 4. Last fall, Tucker stood at the edge of the honeycut field with Hannah and Lily. The harvest was almost done. The plants were beginning to die back the way tomato plants do at the end of the season. They were saving the last of the seed for next year. Lily was holding a honeycut tomato in her small hands. "Granddaddy, why don't we grow the regular kind like the store has?" "Because these are special, Lily." "Why are they special?" Tucker knelt down in front of his granddaughter. "Because your great-great-grandmother gave them to me when I was a young man, and her grandmother gave them to her, and her grandmother gave them to her, and it goes back further than anybody knows. These tomatoes have been in our family longer than the farm has been in our family, longer than the mountains have been called by their current names, maybe longer than there have been roads through these mountains at all. That's a long time." "Yes, ma'am, that's a long time." Lily looked at the tomato in her hands. "Will I get to keep them too, Granddaddy?" "Yes, Lily. They'll be yours when you're ready." "And then will I give them to my granddaughter?" "That'll be up to you, but I hope so." Lily nodded, the way 6-year-olds nod when they understand something important, even if they don't fully understand why it's important. Then she picked up her basket and went back to picking seed tomatoes. Tucker watched her work. He thought about the Cherokee woman in 1851. He thought about Sarah Honeycutt walking up from Tennessee in 1898 with seeds wrapped in cloth. He thought about his grandmother on her porch in 1983, holding the coffee can in her lap. He thought about the 4 acres of green tomatoes in the summer of 2003 When every commercial field in the county was dying, the chain was still going. It was unbroken. It would extend, if Lily decided to extend it, into a future Tucker would never see. That was enough. Now let me tell you the lesson, because it's the only thing left to say. There are people in this world who will tell you that the old ways don't matter. They will tell you that grandmother's seeds are sentimental nonsense. They will tell you that progress means leaving the past behind. They will laugh at you for 20 years if you don't agree with them. And then a disease will come that nobody saw coming. And the modern varieties will fail uniformly because they were all bred to be the same. And the old seeds, the ones grown by stubborn people who refuse to listen to the laughter, will be the only thing left standing. This has happened many times in human history. It will happen many more times. Diversity survives. Uniformity dies. The wisdom passed down through cloth bags and coffee cans and grandmother's kitchen tables is worth more than every laboratory and every research station, because that wisdom has already passed every test that nature can devise. Otherwise, it would not still be here. Tucker Ramsey didn't save the world. He just saved his farm, and he kept his grandmother's promise, and he refused to let a chain that had been extending for at least 150 years get broken on his watch. That's not a small thing. That's the thing. The honeycut tomato is still growing in 17 states. The seeds are still free. The chain is still extending. Sometime around 2080 or 2090, if everything goes the way Tucker hopes, a little girl who hasn't been born yet will hold one of those tomatoes in her hands and ask her grandmother where they came from. And her grandmother, who used to be a 6-year-old named Lily, will tell her the story of a Cherokee woman in 1851, and a young woman walking up from Tennessee in 1898, and a man named Tucker Ramsey who refused to give up on his grandmother's seeds, and the summer of 2003, when every commercial tomato in Yancey County turned black and died, and one farm on the south slope of a ridge stayed green. That's the story. That's why we save the seed. That's why we don't listen when they laugh. Sometimes the oldest thing in the bag is the only thing that lives. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.